Picture this. It's a crisp autumn morning in 1902, and a young Italian man steps off a train in Switzerland, his pockets nearly empty, his heart full of revolutionary fire. His name is Benito Mussolini, and he's running from military service. He has no idea that in just a few decades, he'll help plunge the entire world into the most devastating conflict humanity has ever witnessed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. This is the story of how the world went from an uneasy peace to total war. And trust me, it's going to be one hell of a ride. Let's start with our Italian friend, shall we? Mussolini wasn't always the fascist dictator we remember today. In fact, he started out as the complete opposite. This guy was a hardcore socialist, the kind who would write passionate articles for socialist newspapers, work tirelessly for trade unions, and openly advocate for the violent overthrow of European monarchies. You know, typical revolutionary stuff. But here's the thing about being a revolutionary in early 20th century Europe. It tends to get you in trouble with the authorities. The Swiss police weren't exactly fans of his inflammatory rhetoric, so they arrested him. Then they sent him back to Italy, where he was set free. So naturally, he returned to Switzerland, where he was arrested again. Seeing a pattern here? Eventually, he went back to Italy, completed the military service he'd been avoiding in the first place, had a brief and probably very awkward stint as an elementary school teacher, and then returned to his true passion, socialism. Now, Mussolini wasn't just any socialist. This man had talent. His speeches could electrify a crowd, his journalistic abilities were genuinely impressive, and he quickly became a celebrity among Italian socialists. He was staunchly anti-war, so when Italy decided to colonize Libya in 1910, Mussolini did what any self-respecting anti-war activist would do. He rioted and got arrested. Again. Are you noticing how often this guy ended up behind bars? Then came World War I, and initially Mussolini protested Italy's involvement just like you'd expect. But then something changed in his mind. He had an epiphany, if you will. He suddenly realized that this war, this massive continental bloodbath, could actually create the perfect social conditions for overthrowing European monarchies and bringing about the socialist revolution he'd been dreaming of. Overnight, he became pro-war. His fellow socialists were not amused. They kicked him out of the party faster than you can say ideological inconsistency. But Mussolini wasn't the type to give up. If socialism wasn't going to work for him, he'd create something entirely new. He looked at Italy and saw a nation divided by class warfare, a nation that had lost its glory, a nation that needed unity. And how do you create unity? Through nationalism, of course. He envisioned conquering the Mediterranean, reuniting all Italian peoples just like in the glorious days of the Roman Empire. He called this new ideology Fascismo and promised it would guide Italy to greatness. Oh, and he also decided to go bald, because apparently that's the look of a future dictator. Meanwhile, Italy's situation after World War I was less than ideal. They'd been on the winning side, sure, but they felt completely shortchanged. All that sacrifice, all those lives lost, and for what? A handful of territorial gains that seemed pathetic compared to what the other allies received. Add to this a struggling economy and weak, ineffective governments, and you've got a recipe for political instability. The Italian people were unhappy, frustrated, and desperately looking for someone, anyone, who could fix their problems. Enter Mussolini stage right, promising to restore Italy's glory. His fascist movement exploded in popularity. In 1922, he walked up to the king with what might be the ballsiest political move in history and said, essentially, "Make me prime minister or I'll make myself prime minister." The king, probably looking at the massive army Mussolini had assembled, decided that discretion was the better part of valor and agreed. Just like that, Mussolini began establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe now had fascist dictator number 2. Hitler and Mussolini had remarkably similar ideas about how the world should work. They both embraced authoritarianism. They both believed in the superiority of their respective peoples. They both wanted to expand their territories and build empires. But more importantly than their similarities, they had the same enemies: Britain and France, the dominant Allied powers, were obstacles to both men's ambitions. Naturally, they started to get along. But wait, there's more. On the other side of the world, Japan was about to join this exclusive club of aggressive, expansionist nations. Let's rewind a bit and talk about Japan's journey to this moment. For over 200 years, Japan had isolated itself from the rest of the world, existing in self-imposed seclusion. Then the Americans showed up with their intimidating warships and essentially said, "You're going to trade with us and you're going to like it." Japan, lacking the military power to resist, had no choice but to comply. The Western powers then imposed a series of what were diplomatically called unequal treaties, which were exactly as one-sided as they sound. Japan's economy was struggling and they had virtually no natural resources, so they decided to go get some. They went to war with China, gained a sphere of influence over Korea, and took a bunch of Chinese territory and resources. But then the Western powers, displaying breathtaking hypocrisy, told them to cut it out. Japan, unable to challenge the West militarily, reluctantly backed down. But then they watched in frustration as those same Western powers carved up the weakened China for themselves, establishing their own spheres of influence in the very territory Japan had weakened through war. The message was clear. When Western nations did it, it was legitimate imperialism. When Japan did it, it was unacceptable aggression. Understandably angry, Japan decided to prove they could compete with the great powers. They went to war with Russia and shocked absolutely everyone by winning. Then they fully annexed Korea. During World War I, they seized Germany's colonies and island possessions in Asia. And then, in an incident that was very likely staged by the Japanese army itself, a bomb blew up a Japanese train in Manchuria, giving them the perfect excuse to launch an invasion and take over the region. See the pattern here? So here's where we stood by the mid-1930s. Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan all believed in their own racial or cultural superiority. All three felt hostility toward the Allied powers. All three wanted to militarize their societies and expand their territories. And all three were led by men who were willing to use extreme violence to achieve their goals. The stage was set for catastrophe. Let's start with Germany and Hitler's systematic dismantling of the Treaty of Versailles. He hated that treaty with every fiber of his being, and now that he had power, he was ready to tear it apart piece by piece. In complete violation of the treaty, he established the first Luftwaffe squadrons, introduced military conscription, and massively expanded his army. The Allies, still traumatized by World War I and desperately wanting to avoid another conflict, did nothing. Then Hitler sent his army marching back into the demilitarized Rhineland, actually giving orders to immediately retreat if the Allies showed up to oppose them. The Allies did nothing. Hitler must have been amazed at how easy this was. With his militarily re-strengthened, he could move on to step 2 of his master plan. Hitler wanted to rapidly increase the Aryan population, and to do so, he needed Lebensraum, living space. In other words, he needed to conquer territory. Eventually, he wanted to take over the world, but for now, a substantial portion of Europe would suffice. He began eyeing up his neighbors like a predator sizing up prey. The Allies finally started to get worried, so they implemented a diplomatic strategy called appeasement, which might be the most pathetically ineffective policy in modern history. Here's how it worked. Hitler would demand something, the Allies would say no, then immediately cave and give it to him while making him promise not to ask for anything else. Then Hitler would ask for something else, and the cycle would repeat. It was like watching someone try to negotiate with a toddler, except this toddler had tanks and an army. In 1938, Hitler's army marched into Austria and just took it. No resistance, no fighting, just walked in and annexed an entire country. The Allies protested but did nothing substantive. Next, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia with a significant ethnic German population. The Allies held a meeting with Hitler in Munich, and here's where it gets darkly comedic. They held this meeting about Czechoslovakia's territory without even inviting Czechoslovakia to the table. The Czech representatives were literally sitting in an adjacent room while foreign powers decided their fate. The Allies agreed to give Hitler what he wanted in exchange for a signed promise that he wouldn't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home waving this piece of paper triumphantly, declaring that he had secured peace for our time. Spoiler alert, he hadn't. Almost immediately, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. Because of course he did. What did anyone expect? The man was Hitler. Not to be outdone by his German friend, Mussolini also wanted to expand Italy's empire. He looked around for the easiest possible target and found Ethiopia, a not yet colonized nation that was so militarily underdeveloped that its defenders would literally be fighting Italian tanks with bows and arrows and wooden spears. The war was less a military conflict and more a massacre, but Mussolini got his conquest. Italy also wanted to control the entrance to the Adriatic Sea, so they occupied Albania, because why not?
Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan was continuing its aggressive expansion. In another incident that was almost certainly staged, gunfire was exchanged at the Marco Polo Bridge between Japanese and Chinese troops, giving Japan the excuse it needed to launch a full-scale invasion of China. Japanese forces swept through Beijing and Shanghai, then advanced through the Yangtze Valley to China's capital at the time, Nanking. What happened in Nanking represents some of the worst atrocities committed during the entire war, a horrific orgy of violence against Chinese civilians that shocked the world and remains a source of deep historical pain to this day. Back in Europe, Germany and Italy decided to make their relationship official by signing the Pact of Steel in 1939. Hitler then turned his attention to Poland and the hated Polish Corridor, a strip of territory that split Germany in two. By this point, the Allies finally realized they had to draw a line somewhere, and they warned Hitler that an invasion of Poland would mean war. But Hitler had a problem. He wanted to continue his expansion eastward, but he didn't want to fight a war on two fronts, which had been Germany's fatal mistake in World War I. So he did something that shocked the Western powers to their core. He made a deal with Stalin. Think about this for a moment. Nazi Germany, with its virulent anti-communist ideology, making an alliance with the Soviet Union, the world's first communist state. These two nations were supposed to be mortal enemies, and yet here was Hitler proposing they both invade Poland and split it between them. Stalin, ever the pragmatist, and probably planning his own betrayal, agreed. This alliance stunned the West, but it made perfect strategic sense for both dictators, at least in the short term. On September 1, 1939, German troops crossed into Poland, and Britain and France finally did what they should have done years earlier. They declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. The Poles fought bravely, but they stood no chance against the massive German war machine crashing down from the west and the Soviet forces invading from the east. Poland was crushed between two totalitarian giants, and its suffering was only beginning. Then came a strange period that historians call the Phony War, where everyone sort of just sat around not doing much of anything. The French launched a small, half-hearted invasion into the Saarland, but they maintained mostly defensive positions and eventually just turned around and went home. It was the strangest opening to a world war imaginable. Speaking of France, the French military was still living in the past, still basking in the glory of their World War I victory. They hadn't really adapted to modern warfare. They still used horses for transportation, dispatched messages by motorcycle instead of using radios, had commanders who gave vague orders, and troops who were rarely inspected or properly trained. They built an impressive line of defenses along their German border called the Maginot Line, but inexplicably didn't bother extending it all the way to the English Channel. They also refused to launch artillery strikes against Germany out of fear of retaliation. Let that sink in. In a war, they didn't want to attack the enemy because the enemy might attack them back. That's literally what war is.
The British weren't much better initially. Chamberlain still naively hoped the war could be ended diplomatically. Instead of dropping bombs on German cities, the Royal Air Force dropped propaganda leaflets, which one air marshal sarcastically noted probably did nothing except provide the continent with toilet paper for the duration of the war. Britain only sent 200,000 troops to France, while the French had mobilized millions. Both Britain and France were desperately trying to avoid a repeat of World War I's trench warfare nightmare, so they wanted to keep the fighting as far from home as possible. Their eyes turned north toward Norway. Neutral Sweden was exporting iron ore to Germany through neutral Norway, and this iron was crucial to Germany's war machine. The Allies asked Norway and Sweden to please stop this, but both nations refused, wanting to maintain their neutrality. Then the Soviet Union attacked Finland, and the Allies saw an opportunity. They proposed landing troops in Norway and moving them across Sweden to help Finland, conveniently taking control of the iron fields along the way. Norway and Sweden still said no, so Britain mined Norwegian waters and attacked a German tanker in the area. Hitler quickly realized what the Allies were trying to do and moved fast to secure his iron supply. He launched an invasion through Denmark into Norway. The Allies rushed to land troops at ports along the Norwegian coast, but Germany had already taken control of the airfields, and their air superiority decided the fight. The Allies had to retreat in what was an embarrassing failure. After this debacle, Chamberlain resigned. He was replaced by Winston Churchill, a man who had a very different approach to dealing with the Germans. Churchill was a fighter, a man who would never surrender, and his appointment marked a fundamental shift in British strategy. Hitler's overall strategy was similar to Germany's World War I plan: attack France, defeat France quickly, knock Britain out of the war in the process, then turn eastward to deal with the Soviet Union. During the Phony War, the Allies had given Hitler months to prepare his forces. Now he was ready to attack. The Allies wanted to place troops in Belgium, but Belgium refused, desperately clinging to neutrality. Then, in a move that surprised absolutely no one, Hitler launched an invasion through Belgium to get around France's defenses. The Allies charged into Belgium at full speed to meet the German invasion head-on, and it looked like a repeat of World War I was coming. But Hitler had a trick up his sleeve: Blitzkrieg, lightning war. As the German forces advanced, they sent thousands of refugees fleeing westward, clogging the roads and slowing down the Allied response. Meanwhile, to the south, the French had left the Ardennes forest region relatively undefended because they believed the terrain was naturally impenetrable. The Germans were about to prove them catastrophically wrong. They smashed 50 Wehrmacht divisions through the Ardennes, breaking through defenses that the French had assumed were secure. The German forces then encircled the Allied armies at lightning speed. The best of the Allied forces were now trapped in a shrinking pocket, being squeezed from all sides. The Germans were systematically destroying France's best armies and nearly wiped out the British expeditionary force as well. But the British managed a desperate, miraculous escape at Dunkirk, with civilian ships making the perilous journey across the English Channel to bring their soldiers home. It was a defeat, but it saved the British Army to fight another day. With most of the French forces depleted or demoralized, the Germans breezed through the rest of France, taking Paris, and the nation fell. What Germany couldn't accomplish in 4 years of World War I, Hitler had done in a matter of weeks. It was a stunning, complete victory. Hitler hoped that with France's fall, Britain would lose hope and sue for peace. But quite annoyingly for him, Britain didn't. Churchill and the British people were determined to fight on, alone if necessary. Hitler needed to secure the Western Front before turning east to deal with the Soviet Union, so he tried to force Britain into submission through a combination of military pressure and psychological warfare. Just before France fell, Italy finally declared war on the Allies, kicking Britain while it was down, and making Britain's situation even more desperate. Next, instead of occupying all of France, Hitler occupied the coastal areas for defense, but allowed southern France to continue existing as a German puppet state called Vichy France. This made it look like Britain's old ally had switched sides, further emphasizing Britain's isolation. Hitler also hoped Britain wouldn't attack any of Vichy France's naval bases or colonies in Africa, giving him an extra defensive line to the south. But the British, under Churchill's ruthless leadership, sailed down to France's naval base at Mers el-Kebir in Algeria and destroyed a significant portion of the French fleet to prevent it from falling into German hands. It was a brutal but necessary decision that showed Britain's determination to fight on.
Hitler then began planning Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Great Britain. Before German troops could land on British soil, he needed air and naval superiority across the English Channel. This began the Battle of Britain, one of the most crucial battles of the entire war. Waves of German bombers attacked Britain while the outnumbered Royal Air Force worked heroically around the clock to defend their homeland. Initially, the Luftwaffe targeted British ports and coastal facilities, then shifted to attacking RAF bases, systematically crippling Britain's ability to defend itself. It looked like Hitler's invasion was inevitable. But then Churchill made a brilliant strategic decision. He ordered a small, relatively insignificant bombing raid on Berlin. The raid didn't do much physical damage, but it did something far more important. It enraged Hitler. The Führer was absolutely furious that the British had dared to attack the German capital, and in his rage he made a critical mistake. He immediately ordered the Luftwaffe to stop attacking RAF bases and instead focus on bombing civilian targets in London. This was exactly what Churchill had hoped for. The shift in focus gave the RAF desperately needed breathing space to reorganize and repair. Hitler had essentially shot himself in the foot. The Blitz began, and British civilians endured months of nightly bombing raids. Children were evacuated from cities to the countryside, separated from their parents to keep them safe. Trips to air raid shelters became a daily routine. But British morale held firm in the face of this terror. The famous photographs from this period show Londoners casually going about their business, knitting and reading in underground stations while bombs fell above. These people had nerves of steel. Finally, the Luftwaffe launched one massive, all-out attack on London, throwing everything they had at the city. The RAF successfully repelled it, destroying many German aircraft in the process and firmly establishing British air superiority. Hitler's invasion had to be postponed indefinitely. Britain had survived, alone and bloodied, but unbowed. And this is where our story pauses, because what comes next is even more dramatic, even more devastating. The war would expand to North Africa, to the Soviet Union, to the Pacific, becoming truly global in scope. Millions more would die. Entire cities would be reduced to rubble. The Holocaust would claim 6 million Jewish lives in humanity's darkest hour. But Britain's survival in 1940 meant that there was still hope, still resistance, still a free nation fighting against tyranny. Churchill's famous words captured this moment perfectly. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." The story of World War II is ultimately a story about the consequences of appeasement, about how weakness in the face of aggression only invites more aggression. It's about how economic desperation and national humiliation can be exploited by demagogues and dictators. It's about how quickly democracy can collapse when people are willing to trade freedom for promises of security and glory. But it's also about resilience, about ordinary people displaying extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming evil. It's about nations finding strength they didn't know they possessed when everything seemed lost. From Mussolini's journey from socialist revolutionary to fascist dictator, to Hitler's rise from failed artist and imprisoned rabble-rouser to absolute ruler of Germany, to Japan's transformation from isolated nation to aggressive empire, we see how the seeds of World War II were planted years before the first shots were fired. The Treaty of Versailles, designed to prevent another war, instead created the conditions that made another war inevitable. The failure of the League of Nations, the policy of appeasement, the isolationism of the United States in the 1930s, all of these factors contributed to allowing aggressive dictatorships to grow unchecked until war became unavoidable. The human cost of this conflict would be staggering. Somewhere between 70 and 85 million people would die before it ended, making it the deadliest conflict in human history. Entire generations were scarred by trauma. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. The old European empires would never recover their former dominance. The United States and the Soviet Union would emerge as superpowers, setting the stage for the Cold War. The atomic age would begin with the horrific bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world would be forever changed. But in 1940, with Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany, with France fallen, with the Soviet Union still allied with Hitler, with the United States still neutral, the outcome was far from certain. The darkest days were still ahead. The story of how Britain survived, how the Soviet Union was invaded and turned the tide on the Eastern Front, how the Allies finally achieved victory, that's a story that would take hours to tell in full. But it all stems from these crucial years, these critical decisions, these moments when the world teetered on the brink of falling into complete darkness. The lesson we must take from this history is clear. Freedom is never guaranteed, peace is never permanent, and tyranny must be opposed early and firmly, not appeased and accommodated. The men and women who lived through this era, who fought and died to preserve freedom, who endured unimaginable hardship and suffering, they have left us with a sacred responsibility to remember, to learn, and to ensure that such a catastrophe never happens again. Their sacrifice demands nothing less than our eternal vigilance and our commitment to the principles they fought to defend: democracy, freedom, human dignity, and peace. This is the story of how the world went to war, how millions died, how evil spread across the globe like a plague, and ultimately, at tremendous cost, that evil was defeated. It's a story that must never be forgotten, because those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. And we must not, ever allow the horrors of World War II to be repeated. The price was simply too high, the suffering too great, the lessons too important. We owe it to those who came before us to remember their stories, honor their sacrifices, and build a world where such destruction and hatred can never take root again. The rise of fascism, the failure of appeasement, the outbreak of global war, these weren't inevitable. They were the result of choices made by individuals, by nations, by leaders who chose aggression over peace, hatred over understanding, violence over diplomacy. And they were opposed by individuals who chose courage over cowardice, resistance over submission, hope over despair. Both sides were human, both sides made choices, and those choices shaped the world we live in today. Understanding this history, really understanding it in all its complexity and tragedy, is essential if we want to prevent future catastrophes, because the capacity for both great evil and great heroism exists in every generation, in every nation, in every human heart. The question is which side we choose when the moment of testing comes. World War II shows us both the worst and the best of humanity, and in doing so, it teaches us who we can be, for better or for worse. That's why this story matters, why it must be told and retold, why we must never forget.
Let's think about the individuals for a moment. Because behind every statistic, behind every battle, behind every strategic decision, there were real human beings with hopes, fears, dreams, and families. When Hitler sent his armies into Poland, he wasn't just moving pieces on a map. He was condemning millions of actual people to death, displacement, and unspeakable suffering. When Churchill ordered the bombing of Berlin, he knew he was potentially sentencing British civilians to German retaliation, but he made the hard choice anyway, because he understood that sometimes you have to sacrifice in the short term to survive in the long term. When ordinary French and British soldiers charged into Belgium to meet the German invasion, they weren't thinking about grand strategy or historical significance. They were scared young men following orders, hoping they'd survive to see their families again. Most of them wouldn't. Think about the Polish people, caught between two totalitarian monsters, watching their country being carved up and divided like a piece of meat. Think about the Jewish communities across Europe who could sense the gathering storm but had nowhere to go, no nation willing to take them in, trapped in a continent that was about to become their graveyard. Think about the British children being separated from their parents and sent to the countryside, not understanding why they couldn't stay home, clutching their few possessions and trying to be brave. Think about the French soldiers who had survived World War I, who had hoped they'd never have to fight again, now watching their country fall to the same enemy they'd defeated just 2 decades earlier. The human dimension of this conflict is overwhelming when you really contemplate it. And what about the Germans themselves? We often think of Nazi Germany as a monolithic evil, but within that nation were millions of ordinary people who weren't enthusiastic Nazis, who didn't support Hitler's aggressive policies, who were simply trying to survive in a dictatorship where speaking out meant imprisonment or death. There were German soldiers who fought because they had no choice, who didn't believe in Nazi ideology but were conscripted into the Wehrmacht and forced to fight or face execution for desertion. There were German civilians who would later watch their cities burn under Allied bombing raids, paying the price for their leaders' crimes. War doesn't discriminate, it destroys the guilty and innocent alike, and World War II destroyed on a scale that's almost incomprehensible. The technology of death had advanced terrifyingly since World War I. The trenches and machine guns of the earlier conflict were replaced by Blitzkrieg tactics, strategic bombing, and eventually atomic weapons. The Germans perfected combined arms warfare, coordinating tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry in devastating attacks that could overrun entire nations in weeks. The British developed radar technology that gave them a crucial edge in the Battle of Britain, allowing them to detect incoming German bombers and scramble fighters to intercept them. The Americans would later bring their massive industrial capacity to bear, building ships, planes, and weapons at a rate that the Axis powers simply couldn't match. The Soviets would demonstrate a capacity for sacrifice and endurance that defied belief, losing more soldiers in single battles than some nations lost in the entire war, yet continuing to fight. The Japanese would develop their own unique and terrifying form of warfare in the Pacific, including the kamikaze suicide attacks that shocked American forces. But beyond the military technology, there was also the technology of genocide. The Nazis industrialized murder on a scale never before seen, building death camps with gas chambers and crematoriums designed for maximum efficiency in killing human beings. They kept meticulous records of their crimes, documenting the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others they deemed undesirable: Roma, homosexuals, disabled people, political dissidents, Slavs. The Holocaust stands as humanity's darkest hour, a reminder that civilization is a thin veneer that can be stripped away when hatred and ideology are allowed to run unchecked. When we talk about World War II, we cannot separate the military conflict from this moral catastrophe. They are inextricably linked.
The economic dimensions of the war were staggering as well. Nations mobilized their entire economies for total war, converting civilian factories to military production, rationing food and resources, conscripting not just soldiers but workers for the war effort. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs that had previously been reserved for men, forever changing social dynamics and expectations. The United States, still recovering from the Great Depression at the war's start, would emerge as the world's preeminent economic superpower, its industry undamaged by bombing and its workforce massively expanded. The Soviet Union, despite suffering catastrophic destruction, would maintain production by relocating entire factories eastward beyond the reach of German forces, workers laboring in brutal conditions to supply their armies at the front. Britain would exhaust its financial reserves and end the war deeply in debt, the beginning of the end for the British Empire. Germany would see its economy utterly destroyed, its cities in ruins, its people starving. Japan would suffer similar devastation, culminating in the atomic bombings that finally ended the Pacific War. The political consequences would reshape the global order entirely. The old European empires, weakened by the war, would gradually collapse in the decades that followed. India would gain independence from Britain. France would lose its colonies in Indochina and Africa. The Netherlands would lose Indonesia. The age of European dominance was ending, replaced by a bipolar world dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union, two powers with fundamentally incompatible ideologies. The Cold War would emerge from the ashes of World War II, a decades-long struggle that would dominate international relations and threaten the world with nuclear annihilation. The United Nations would be created to prevent future global conflicts, though its effectiveness would be limited by the veto powers given to the Security Council's permanent members.
The cultural impact of World War II resonates to this day. The stories of courage and sacrifice, of resistance and resilience, have become central to national identities. The French remember their resistance fighters who fought against the Nazi occupation. The British take pride in their finest hour when they stood alone against Hitler. The Americans view their intervention as a righteous crusade against evil. The Russians commemorate the Great Patriotic War with reverence for the 27 million Soviets who died defending their homeland. The Japanese have a complex and often controversial relationship with their wartime history, debates over responsibility and victimhood still contentious today. Literature, film, art, and music were all profoundly influenced by the war. Writers who experienced the conflict produced works that captured its horror and absurdity. Catch-22, Slaughterhouse-Five, The Naked and the Dead, these novels and countless others tried to make sense of the senselessness, to find meaning in the chaos. Filmmakers have returned to World War II again and again, producing everything from propaganda to serious historical dramas to action films. The war has become a seemingly inexhaustible source of stories because it encompassed so much human experience: heroism and cowardice, sacrifice and selfishness, hope and despair, love and hate. Artists who survived concentration camps produced works bearing witness to the incomprehensible. Musicians composed pieces commemorating the fallen and celebrating liberation. The war touched every aspect of culture because it touched every aspect of life. The technological and scientific advances driven by the war would shape the modern world in ways both beneficial and terrifying. Radar, jet engines, rockets, computers, nuclear energy, all of these technologies were developed or significantly advanced during the war years. The space race of the Cold War era was built on the foundation of Nazi rocket technology. The digital revolution can trace its roots to code-breaking efforts like those at Bletchley Park, where Alan Turing and his colleagues cracked the German Enigma cipher. Medical advances in treating trauma and infection saved countless lives during and after the war. But the same scientific ingenuity that produced these benefits also produced weapons of unprecedented destructive power. The atomic bomb demonstrated that humanity now possessed the capability to destroy itself, a reality we've lived with ever since. When we examine the leadership on all sides, we see a fascinating array of personalities and approaches. Churchill, with his defiant rhetoric and refusal to surrender, embodied British determination. Roosevelt, paralyzed from polio yet projecting strength and confidence, guiding America from isolationism to global engagement. Stalin, paranoid and brutal, yet effective in mobilizing Soviet resources, played a crucial role in defeating Hitler despite being a dictator himself. Hitler, driven by ideology and hatred, made increasingly irrational decisions as the war turned against him, ultimately destroying Germany in pursuit of his insane vision. Mussolini, always the lesser partner in the Axis alliance, would end his days executed by Italian partisans and hung upside down in a Milan square, a pathetic end for a man who dreamed of reviving Roman glory. The Japanese military leadership, convinced of their divine destiny, would drag their nation to utter defeat rather than accept the unthinkable shame of surrender. The common soldiers and civilians deserve the most recognition, though. The politicians and generals made decisions, but ordinary people bore the consequences. Young men who should have been starting careers and families instead died in muddy fields or frozen forests or burning ships. Women who should have been raising children in peace instead worked in factories, were served as nurses, or joined resistance movements. Children who should have been playing and learning instead huddled in bomb shelters, or fled as refugees, or perished in gas chambers. The elderly who had already survived one world war had to endure another, watching everything they'd rebuilt be destroyed again. Every family in every combatant nation was touched by loss, trauma, or both. The collective suffering was almost unimaginable in scale.
And yet, somehow, humanity survived. Cities were rebuilt, economies recovered, former enemies became allies. The Marshall Plan helped reconstruct Western Europe. Japan transformed from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy and economic powerhouse. Germany was divided, but eventually reunited, becoming the heart of the European Union. The United Nations, despite its limitations, provided a forum for international cooperation and prevented the Cold War from becoming World War III. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights established principles that nations, however imperfectly, aspired to uphold. The Nuremberg trials established that individuals could be held accountable for crimes against humanity, that following orders was not an absolute defense for atrocity. These were genuine achievements born from the ashes of catastrophe. But we must be vigilant because the forces that produced World War II haven't disappeared. Economic anxiety still exists and can be exploited by demagogues. Nationalism still has the power to override reason and compassion. Scapegoating minorities still appeals to those looking for simple answers to complex problems. Authoritarianism still attracts those who value order over freedom. The weapons are even more destructive now than they were then. A third world war fought with modern weapons would be apocalyptic beyond anything we can truly comprehend. That's why understanding World War II matters so much. We must recognize the warning signs, resist the temptations of easy answers and strongmen leaders, defend democratic institutions, however flawed, and remember that freedom, once lost, is incredibly difficult to regain. The veterans of World War II, the greatest generation as they've been called, are rapidly leaving us. Soon there will be no one left to remember the war firsthand, no one who can personally testify to what they saw and experienced. Their stories will exist only in recordings and writings and memories passed down through families. This makes it even more crucial that we preserve and share this history, that we ensure future generations understand not just what happened, but why it happened and what it meant. We owe the dead our remembrance, the survivors our gratitude, and future generations our commitment to learn from this history. So when you think about World War II, don't just think about dates and battles and famous generals. Think about the individual human beings, each with their own story, each with people who loved them and mourned them. Think about the choices that led to war and the choices that eventually brought peace. Think about how easily civilization can collapse and how much effort is required to preserve it. Think about how propaganda and hatred can turn neighbors against each other, and how courage and compassion can resist that darkness. Think about the cost of appeasement and the price of freedom. Think about the banality of evil and the necessity of standing against it. Think about the world we inherited from that generation and the world we'll leave to the next. That's the real lesson of World War II, not just that it happened, but that it could happen again if we're not careful, if we're not vigilant, if we forget.